Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the foundation of our world, literally. We're taking a close look at the construction materials industry, because the materials that build our cities also have a massive impact on our global economy and our environment. We aren't just looking at the products themselves, though. We're going to decode the exact boundaries, the hidden risks, and the heavy environmental and human footprint of this sector exactly as it's defined by the SASB standards. So if you're curious about how investors and regulators actually measure sustainability in one of the heaviest industries on the planet, you are definitely in the right place. Okay, here is our roadmap for today. 1. Defining construction materials. 2. The wood exclusion rule. 3. Heavy environmental impacts. 4. Land and biodiversity management. 5. Workforce health and safety. And 6. Innovation and pricing integrity. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. Defining construction materials, the heavy foundation. When the SASB standards talk about construction materials, they are pointing at a very specific global supply chain. We're primarily talking about heavy extractive producers. Think companies making cement and aggregates. To really wrap your head around the scale here, picture immense, sprawling quarries where the day-to-day operations involve blasting, mining, and hauling millions of tons of crushed stone, sand, and gravel. It also covers the high-heat production of things like glass, plastics, insulation, and bricks. So the absolute core identity of this industry? It's massive earth-moving extraction and high-intensity processing.
Section 2. The wood exclusion rule, setting the boundary.
Now, you might be looking at that list of materials and thinking, wait a second, what about wood? I mean, it's one of the most common building materials on the planet, right? You see it on almost every residential construction site. So why on earth isn't it considered a construction material here? It's a really great question, and the answer comes down to the fundamental nature of the material itself.
To be absolutely clear on where we draw the line, entities that produce wood building products are explicitly excluded from the construction material standard. Why? Well, because wood is a harvested material grown in living ecosystems. Cement and aggregates, on the other hand, are extractive materials mined directly from the earth. From an investor's perspective, managing a living forest requires a completely different playbook than mitigating the risks of blowing up a rock quarry. Because those risk profiles are so fundamentally totally different, under the Sustainable Industry Classification System, if a company produces wood products, they get classified somewhere else, specifically under Building Products and Furnishings, Forestry Management, or Pulp and Paper Products. The standard we're unpacking today is strictly reserved for the heavy, earth-moving extractors.
Section 3. Heavy environmental impacts, measuring the true footprint.
The production processes we're dealing with here, especially for cement, are incredibly intense. We're talking about massive kilns that have to operate at thousands of degrees to drive complex chemical reactions. Because of that, these companies have to rigorously track their gross global Scope 1 greenhouse gas emissions, which are the direct emissions pouring straight out of their facilities. But it's not just carbon we're worried about. They also have to report on severe air pollutants, things like nitrogen oxides, sulfur oxides, heavy metals, and particulate matter. These are not minor emissions. They're highly toxic byproducts that carry huge regulatory risks. And on the waste side of things, they generate a highly alkaline byproduct called cement kiln dust, or CKD, which needs incredibly careful hazardous waste management so it doesn't devastate the local environment.
To fuel those giant kilns, the energy consumption is pretty much astronomical. Companies are required to report their total energy consumed in gigajoules. But even more importantly, they have to report exactly where it comes from. They break down the percentage of grid electricity versus renewables. But here's a really fascinating detail. They also track alternative energy. In this specific industry, that often means burning waste from other sectors to fire the kilns. We're talking scrap tires, waste oils, sometimes even processed municipal solid waste. It's a clever way to lower fuel costs, sure, but it requires incredibly strict emissions monitoring. If a company fails to properly filter the emissions from burning a bunch of scrap tires, they're looking at massive fines and potential shutdowns. You simply can't trade energy savings for toxic air pollution.
Processing these heavy materials also requires millions upon millions of gallons of water. And it's not enough for a company to just report how much water they withdraw overall. The standard specifically demands to know the percentage of water consumed in regions facing high or extremely high baseline water stress. I mean, imagine trying to run a water-intensive aggregate plant in a region that's going through a historic drought. It ceases to be just an environmental issue. Production literally comes to a halt. That is a massive financial and operational risk that investors absolutely need to have eyes on.
Section 4. Land and biodiversity management, the quarry life cycle.
You literally can't operate a quarry without altering the earth. You're ripping out vegetation, blasting solid stone, and changing the natural topography forever. Because of this, entities are required to have comprehensive environmental management plans that cover every single distinct stage of a site's life cycle. This starts way before the first shovel even hits the dirt, during the pre-bid and exploration phase. Then it moves into site development, goes through years, sometimes decades of active production, and crucially, mandates a concrete plan for closure, decommissioning, and the ultimate restoration of that land.
To actually keep companies accountable here, the specific metric used tracks the absolute number of hectares of terrestrial land disturbed. But the counter metric is just as important. What percentage of that impacted area has been actively restored? And listen, restored doesn't just mean abandoning the site, walking away, and letting some weeds grow over the old machinery. It means actively assisting the recovery of the ecosystem that was degraded or destroyed by the quarrying process, making sure it returns to a natural, thriving state.
Section 5. Workforce Health and Safety, Human Impact.
Heavy equipment, massive moving parts, and explosive blasting naturally introduce some pretty severe hazards. Companies obviously track actual injuries, but under these standards, they also have to track what's called the near-miss frequency rate. A near miss is exactly what it sounds like, an event that didn't hurt anyone this time, but easily could have under slightly different circumstances. Tracking these near misses for both direct employees and independent contractors is absolutely key to building a proactive safety culture. By including contractors, they close a major loophole in safety reporting, which allow companies to fix deadly hazards before a tragedy actually happens.
And then you've got the chronic hidden dangers. The standard specifically requires the disclosure of any reported cases of silicosis. If you don't know, silicosis is a severe, irreversible lung disease caused by inhaling microscopic crystalline silica dust. And that dust is literally everywhere when you are crushing and grinding stone and sand all day. This represents a profound human cost in this industry, and it's one that has to be rigorously tracked and mitigated.
Because silicosis is so severe, companies can't just report the numbers and move on. They have to explicitly detail their efforts to minimize this exposure. This means proving they have rigorous respirator programs, advanced engineering controls, like heavy-duty industrial ventilation and water suppression systems, and comprehensive safety training. A company that decides to cut corners on water suppression systems today is basically inviting massive human suffering and immense legal liability tomorrow. It's really a non-negotiable metric for assessing how much a company values its workforce's long-term health.
Section 6. Innovation and Pricing Integrity, Market Realities.
Let's talk business realities. It's an uncomfortable truth, but historically, the nature of heavy construction materials has made this market highly susceptible to anti-competitive behavior. Because heavy materials like cement and aggregates are incredibly expensive to transport over long distances, these companies often operate in localized monopolies. And that makes the temptation for price fixing much, much higher. To force transparency, entities have to disclose any total monetary losses resulting from legal proceedings tied to cartel activities, price fixing, or antitrust behavior. Investors need to know for sure if a company's profits are coming from genuine operational efficiency or just from illegal market manipulation.
This is exactly why the global financial system is paying such close attention. By adhering to these strict SASB standards, which, by the way, are now under the stewardship of the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, companies provide a standardized, transparent look into their operations. It ensures that all these complex regulatory, environmental, and compliance risks get translated into the universal language of finance. It brings some much-needed global accounting rigor to sustainability.
But hey, it's not all just about mitigating risk. There is actually a massive financial upside here. The standard asks companies to compare their traditional high-emission product lines against their total addressable market for innovative products. We're talking about next-generation materials that reduce energy usage, require less water to manufacture, or heavily utilize recycled materials. The companies that can successfully capture market share in the sustainable innovation space, they are positioning themselves for massive long-term growth.
Which leaves us with this final, somewhat provocative thought. We learned earlier that harvested wood is exclusively excluded from this sector's boundary. This industry is strictly defined by heavy, carbon-intensive extraction. So if we can't just rely on planting more trees to offset this specific sector, how quickly can the heavy construction materials industry innovate its kilns, its quarries, and its chemistry to meet the demands of a sustainable world? The standards are in place to measure their progress. The real question is, who is going to step up and lead the way? Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer.